I never thought I'd find myself sitting at her bedside, the room heavy with the scent of antiseptic and fading lilies, the late afternoon sun casting long, trembling shadows across the floor. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound, a metronome counting down the moments I had left with her. My mother, always so strong, so composed, now looked impossibly small beneath the hospital sheets, her hands frail and cold in mine. I watched her chest rise and fall, each breath a struggle, each exhale a reminder that time was running out. We had been together for years, bound by the invisible threads of family, history, and unspoken words. I thought I knew her. I thought I understood the woman who raised me, who sacrificed so much, who carried herself with quiet dignity even when life was unkind. But as I sat there, listening to the rasp of her breathing, I realized there was a distance between us, a shadow that had always lingered at the edge of our lives, never fully acknowledged, never explained. She turned her head toward me, her eyes searching mine with a desperation I'd never seen before. There was something she needed to say, something she had carried for decades, locked away behind polite smiles and careful silences. I could feel it in the way her fingers tightened around mine, in the way her lips trembled as she tried to speak. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation. What could possibly be so important, so devastating that she had kept it hidden all these years? I leaned in, my own voice barely a whisper. "It's okay, Mom. You can tell me." I had no idea what I was inviting, no clue how her next words would unravel everything I thought I knew about our family, about her, about myself. If I had known what she was about to reveal, I might have braced myself, but nothing could have prepared me for the truth that would change everything. The days before her final illness had a strange golden quality to them, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I remember the way the light filtered through the kitchen window in the mornings, painting soft patterns on the worn wooden table where she sat with her tea. My mother had always been an early riser, a habit she claimed was left over from her childhood on the farm. Even as her body grew weaker, she clung to her routines with quiet determination, as if the simple act of boiling water and slicing bread could keep the chaos of the world at bay. We lived together in the old house on Maple Lane, the one with the peeling blue shutters and the wild rose bushes that threatened to swallow the front porch every spring. It was the house I'd grown up in, the house where my father's laughter once echoed through the halls, where my brother and I had raced up and down the stairs, our feet thundering like a summer storm. Now it was just the two of us, me and my mother, moving through the familiar rooms like ghosts, careful not to disturb the memories that lingered in every corner. Our relationship was close, but not without its shadows. There was a warmth between us, a deep affection built on years of shared meals, whispered confidences, and the kind of small, everyday kindnesses that go unnoticed by the world. She would press a hand to my cheek when I came home late from work, her eyes soft with concern. I would bring her fresh flowers from the market, arranging them in the chipped vase she loved. We had our rituals, our private language of glances and half-smiles, the shorthand of people who have weathered many storms together. But beneath the surface, there was a tension I could never quite name. It was there in the way she sometimes stared out the window for long stretches, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the garden. It was in the way she would change the subject when certain topics came up. My father's sudden death, the years we spent barely scraping by, the relatives we never spoke of. There were questions I had learned not to ask, silences I had learned to respect. I told myself it was just her way, that some people carried their pain quietly, like a stone in their pocket. Still, I couldn't help but notice the way her hands would tremble when she thought no one was watching, or the way she would flinch at the sound of raised voices on the television. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear her moving through the house, her footsteps soft and uncertain. I would find her in the living room, staring at old photographs or leafing through letters she never let me read.
When I asked if she was all right, she would smile and say she was just having trouble sleeping. I wanted to believe her, but I could feel the weight of something unspoken pressing down on both of us. Despite the undercurrent of unease, there were genuine moments of joy. We would sit together on the porch in the evenings, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, sharing stories from my childhood. She would laugh at my terrible jokes, her eyes crinkling at the corners, and for a little while the years seemed to fall away. I cherished those moments, clinging to them like lifelines, even as I sensed that something was shifting between us. As her health began to decline, I became her caretaker in ways I never expected. I managed her medications, drove her to doctor's appointments, and learned to cook the bland, nourishing meals her doctors recommended. She hated the fuss, insisting she could manage on her own, but I could see the fear in her eyes each time she lost her balance or forgot a name. I tried to be patient, to hide my own worry behind a mask of calm competence, but the truth was, I was terrified. I was losing her, bit by bit, and there was nothing I could do to stop it.
In those quiet days, I found myself thinking about all the things we had never said to each other. I wondered about the secrets she kept, the burdens she carried alone. I wanted to ask her about the past, to fill in the gaps in our family story, but I was afraid of what I might find. It was easier to focus on the present, to pour her another cup of tea, to tuck an extra blanket around her shoulders. I told myself there would be time for questions later, that the truth could wait. But as I sat by her bedside, watching the light fade from her eyes, I realized that time was running out. The calm before the storm was over. The answers I had been too afraid to seek were finally within reach, and I knew that whatever she was about to tell me would change everything. Looking back, I realized the signs were always there, scattered throughout our days like breadcrumbs I never thought to follow. My mother had a way of retreating into herself, even in the middle of a conversation. Sometimes I would find her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a mug of tea gone cold, her eyes fixed on a spot just beyond the window. If I asked what she was thinking, she would startle, as if I'd pulled her back from some distant shore, and offer a vague answer about the weather or the garden. It was as if she lived with one foot in the present and the other in a place I could never reach. There were moments when her mask would slip, and I'd catch a glimpse of something raw and unguarded in her expression. Once, while sorting through a box of old family photos, I handed her a faded picture of a young woman standing beside a man I didn't recognize. My mother's face went pale, and she snatched the photo from my hand so quickly it startled me. She tucked it away at the bottom of the box, her fingers trembling. When I asked who the man was, she shook her head and said, "Just someone from a long time ago. It doesn't matter now." But the way her voice caught on the words told me it mattered very much. She was careful with her words, always choosing them with the precision of someone who had learned the cost of saying too much. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, she would let slip a cryptic comment that hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. "We all make mistakes," she said once, her gaze fixed on the flickering light of the television. "Some things you can't ever take back." I wanted to ask what she meant, but the look on her face warned me not to press. It was a look I'd seen before, a silent plea to let the past stay buried. Her withdrawn behavior became more pronounced as her illness progressed. She stopped answering the phone when old friends called, letting their voices fade into the answering machine. She avoided family gatherings, claiming she was too tired or not feeling well. When I suggested inviting my brother over for dinner, she hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe another time," she said, her tone final. I wondered if she was angry with him or if there was something else she didn't want to face. I began to notice how she guarded certain possessions with unusual care. There was a small wooden box she kept in her bedroom, locked and hidden at the back of her closet. I'd seen her take it out late at night, her shoulders hunched as she sifted through its contents. Once, I caught a glimpse of a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and what looked like a child's drawing, yellowed with age. When she realized I was watching, she quickly closed the box and turned away. Her face shuddered. "Just old memories," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes she would wake from nightmares, her cries echoing down the hallway. I would rush to her room and find her sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide and wild, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She would cling to my hand until the fear passed, then insist she was fine, that it was just a bad dream. But I could see the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands shook as she smoothed the covers. I wanted to help her, to ease whatever pain haunted her sleep, but she kept her secrets close, locked away behind walls I couldn't breach. There were other clues, too, small but telling. She flinched at the sound of certain names, avoided certain streets when we drove through town. She refused to talk about her childhood, brushing off my questions with a tight smile. "That was a long time ago," she would say, as if the years alone were enough to erase whatever had happened. But I could see the sadness in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged under the weight of memories she couldn't share. I began to sense a pattern in her silences, a rhythm to the things she left unsaid. It was as if she was always on guard, afraid that one careless word might let the truth slip out. I started to wonder what she was protecting, herself or me. The more I tried to piece together the fragments of her past, the answers became more elusive. It was like chasing shadows, each clue leading only to more questions. Despite my growing unease, I tried to respect her boundaries. I told myself that everyone has things they'd rather forget, that maybe some secrets were better left alone. But the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger with each passing day. I could see it in the way she avoided my gaze, in the way her laughter sometimes died in her throat, in the way she clung to me a little tighter each time I said goodnight. I didn't know it then, but I was standing on the edge of a revelation that would shake the foundation of everything I believed about my mother, about our family, about myself. The signs were all around me, if only I had the courage to look a little closer. Growing up in our house meant learning to read between the lines. There were things we talked about, school, chores, the weather, the price of groceries, and things we didn't. The unspoken rules of our family were as much a part of my upbringing as bedtime stories or Sunday dinners. I learned early that some questions were met with silence, some memories were off limits, and some names were never spoken at all.
My mother was the architect of this quiet code. She had a way of steering conversations away from dangerous territory, her voice gentle but firm. If my brother or I asked about her childhood, she would smile and say, "Oh, it was a different time," before changing the subject to something safer. If we pressed, she would busy herself with dishes or laundry, her back turned, her posture stiff. My father, for his part, seemed to understand the boundaries instinctively. He never asked about her family, never mentioned the years before they met. It was as if her life had started the day she married him, and everything before that was a closed book. There were other silences, too. When my father died suddenly, the house filled with mourners and casseroles, but no one spoke about the way he'd changed in those last months, the way he'd grown distant and distracted. My mother accepted condolences with a tight smile, her eyes dry and clear. She never cried in front of us, never let us see her grief. I remember sitting on the edge of her bed one night, wanting to ask if she was okay, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I hugged her, and she patted my back, murmuring that we would be all right. I wanted to believe her. As I grew older, I started to notice the gaps in our family history. There were no stories about grandparents or cousins, no old photographs on the walls. When friends at school talked about family reunions or holiday traditions, I felt a pang of envy. Our holidays were quiet affairs, just the three of us, and later, just the two. I asked my mother once why we never visited her hometown, and she replied that there was nothing left for her there. The finality in her voice made it clear the subject was closed. My brother, always more rebellious than I, tried to push the boundaries. He would ask pointed questions at the dinner table, his tone half joking, half accusatory. "Why don't we ever talk about Grandpa?
Did he run off and join the circus or something? My mother laughed, but there was a brittleness to it, a warning. Some things are better left in the past, she'd say, and that was the end of it. Over time, even my brother learned to let the questions go. But I couldn't. The older I got, the more the silences bothered me. I started to collect the little clues my mother let slip, a mention of a sister she hadn't seen in decades, a reference to a childhood friend who didn't make it. I pieced together what I could, but the picture never quite made sense. There were too many missing pieces, too many stories that ended before they began. The culture of silence extended beyond our immediate family. When relatives visited, their conversations were careful, their laughter a little too loud. I remember one aunt, my mother's cousin, who came for Christmas one year. She and my mother sat in the kitchen late into the night, their voices low and urgent. The next morning, my mother was quiet and withdrawn, her eyes red-rimmed. When I asked if everything was all right, she smiled and said she was just tired. I didn't believe her, but I didn't press. There were rules about emotions, too. Anger was something to be swallowed, sadness something to be hidden. My mother believed in keeping up appearances, in presenting a calm, composed face to the world. No one needs to know our business, she would say if I ever cried in public or raised my voice at home. I learned to keep my feelings to myself, to bury my questions deep. But curiosity is a stubborn thing. The more I sensed was being hidden, the more I wanted to know. I started to watch my mother more closely, to listen for the things she didn't say. I noticed how she would tense up when the phone rang late at night, how she would linger over certain letters before tucking them away. I wondered what secrets she was keeping, what stories she was protecting. Sometimes I would lie awake at night replaying old conversations in my mind, searching for clues. I wondered if my mother was ashamed of something, if there was a reason she kept her past locked away. I imagined all sorts of possibilities, an old scandal, a lost love, a family feud that had never healed. The truth, I knew, was probably more complicated than anything I could invent. Still, I respected the rules, even as I chafed against them. I wanted to be a good daughter, to honor my mother's wishes. But the older I got, the harder it became to ignore the questions that haunted our quiet house. I promised myself that one day I would find the courage to ask her everything. I just hoped that when the time came, it wouldn't be too late. My mother's life was a tapestry woven with sacrifice, each thread a quiet act of love or a silent surrender to necessity. From my earliest memories, I saw how she put others before herself, how she measured her own happiness against the needs of her family. She was the first to rise in the morning, the last to go to bed at night, her days filled with the endless, thankless tasks that kept our world turning. She never complained, at least not in words, but I could see the toll it took in the lines that deepened around her eyes and the way her shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. There were moments of joy, of course, brief, shining interludes that lit up the grayness of our everyday lives. I remember the way she would sing as she cooked, her voice soft and sweet, filling the kitchen with warmth. On summer evenings, she would chase my brother and me through the yard, her laughter ringing out as we darted between the trees. She found happiness in small things, a perfect loaf of bread, a letter from an old friend, the first daffodils of spring. She taught me to look for beauty in the ordinary, to find comfort in routine. But even in those happy moments, there was a sense of restraint, as if she was holding something back. She never indulged herself, never bought new clothes unless the old ones were threadbare, never took time for hobbies or friends. When my father lost his job, she picked up extra shifts at the diner, her hands red and raw from hours of scrubbing dishes. She never let us see her cry, never let us feel the full weight of her worry. Instead, she smiled and told us everything would be all right, even when I could see the fear flickering in her eyes. As I grew older, I began to understand that her sacrifices were not just acts of love, but also acts of penance. There was a quiet desperation in the way she cared for us, a need to prove herself worthy, to atone for something I couldn't name. She poured herself into motherhood with a kind of fierce devotion, as if she believed that by giving us everything, she could erase whatever mistakes haunted her past. I saw it in the way she hovered over us when we were sick, in the way she celebrated our smallest achievements, in the way she never let herself rest. Her shame was never spoken aloud, but it shaped her choices in ways I only recognized much later. She avoided situations that might draw attention to herself, shying away from school events or neighborhood gatherings.
When other mothers gossiped at the playground, she kept her distance, her smile polite but guarded. She was always careful, always cautious, as if she feared that one wrong move would expose her secrets to the world. I didn't understand it then, but I felt the tension in the air, the way she seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for something to go wrong.
There were times when her sorrow broke through the surface, catching me off guard. I remember waking up one night to the sound of muffled sobs coming from the kitchen. I crept down the hallway and found her sitting at the table, her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She didn't see me, and I didn't know what to do, so I stood there in the shadows, feeling helpless. The next morning, she was back to her usual self, bustling around the house as if nothing had happened. I never mentioned what I'd seen, and she never offered an explanation. Despite her struggles, my mother found ways to create moments of happiness for us. She saved up for months to buy me a second-hand bicycle, her face glowing with pride as she watched me ride it for the first time. She baked cakes for our birthdays, even when money was tight, and made sure we always had presents under the tree at Christmas. She celebrated our successes and comforted us in our failures, her love a constant presence in our lives. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that she was haunted by something she could never quite escape. There was a sadness in her eyes that lingered even in her brightest smiles, a sense of longing for a life she might have had if things had been different. I wondered what dreams she had given up, what hopes she had buried for our sake. I wanted to ask her, to tell her it was all right to want something for herself, but the words never came. As I watched her grow older, her sacrifices became even more apparent. She refused to let me take over the household chores, insisting she could manage on her own. She downplayed her aches and pains, brushing off my concerns with a wave of her hand. I saw how tired she was, how the years had worn her down, but she never complained. She carried her burdens with quiet dignity, her shame a shadow that followed her everywhere. It wasn't until her final days that I began to understand the true cost of her sacrifices, the depth of the sorrow she had carried for so long. I realized that her love for us was both a gift and a shield, a way to protect herself from the pain of her past. And as I sat by her bedside, holding her hand, I wished I had told her more often how much she meant to me, how grateful I was for everything she had given up so that I could have a better life. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind that seemed to press the world into silence. I was in my mother's room, tidying up while she napped in the living room, her breathing soft and uneven. The rain tapped against the window, a gentle, persistent rhythm that made the house feel even more isolated. I moved quietly, careful not to disturb her things, but as I reached to dust the top shelf of her closet, my hand brushed against something hard and unfamiliar. Curious, I pulled down a small, battered tin box, its surface scratched and dented from years of use. It was heavier than I expected, and when I shook it gently, something inside shifted with a dull clink. I hesitated, glancing toward the door, half expecting my mother to appear and scold me for snooping. But the house remained still, the only sound the rain and the distant hum of the television. I sat on the edge of her bed and opened the box. Inside, I found a bundle of old letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, their edges yellowed and fragile. Beneath them was a photograph, black and white, of a young woman who looked so much like my mother it made my breath catch. She was standing beside a man I didn't recognize, his arm draped protectively around her shoulders. They both expressed expressions that were hard to read, something between hope and fear. I picked up the top letter, my hands trembling. The handwriting was elegant, looping across the page in a style I'd only seen in my mother's old recipe cards. The letter was addressed to "My dearest Anna," and as I read the first few lines, I realized it wasn't from my father. The words were tender, filled with longing and regret, and they spoke of a time and place I'd never heard my mother mention. There were references to promises made and broken, to dreams that had slipped away. The letter ended abruptly, the last line smudged as if someone had wept over the page. I felt the strange mix of guilt and fascination. I knew I shouldn't be reading her private correspondence, but I couldn't stop myself. I sifted through the rest of the letters, each one revealing a little more,
a secret romance, a decision that had changed the course of her life, a sorrow that lingered in every word. The man in the photograph was mentioned often, always with a sense of longing and loss. There was no mention of my father, no hint of the life she had built with us. It was as if these letters belonged to another woman entirely, someone I'd never met. As I replaced the letters in the box, my mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What had happened between them? Why had my mother kept these letters hidden for so many years? I tried to remember if I had ever mentioned anyone from her past, but nothing came to mind. She had always been so careful, so guarded. The discovery felt like a crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about her. Later that evening, as I made dinner, I overheard my mother talking softly on the phone. Her voice was low, almost pleading, and I caught only fragments of the conversation. "I can't talk about it now. No, not with her here. Please, just let it be." There was a pause, and then she said, "Some things are better left in the past." The words sent a chill through me, echoing the sentiment I had read in the letters. I watched her closely over the next few days, searching for more clues. She seemed more withdrawn than usual, her eyes shadowed with worry. I caught her looking at me once and offered a tight, brittle smile. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She hesitated, then nodded. "Just tired, that's all." But I could see the fear flickering behind her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. That night I lay awake, the rain still falling outside, the sound of it mingling with the questions swirling in my mind. I thought about the letters, the photograph, the strange phone call. I wondered what kind of pain my mother had carried all these years, what secrets she had buried so deep that even her own daughter had never suspected. I wanted to believe that whatever it was, it couldn't change the love I felt for her, but a part of me was afraid of what I might find if I kept digging, afraid of what it would mean for both of us. As I drifted off to sleep, one question echoed in my mind, louder than the rain, sharper than the guilt I felt for prying into her past. What was she hiding? The next morning, the weight of what I'd discovered pressed on me like a stone. I moved through my usual routines, making coffee, folding laundry, checking on my mother, but my mind was elsewhere, circling the letters in the photograph, the fragments of a life I'd never known. I watched her closely, searching for the right moment to bring up what I'd found, but every time I opened my mouth, the words caught in my throat. Finally, as we sat together in the living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the curtains, my mother was knitting, her hands moving with practiced ease, her gaze fixed on the growing length of yarn. I cleared my throat, my heart pounding. "Mom, can I ask you something?" She looked up, her eyes wary. "Of course, dear. What is it?" I hesitated, suddenly unsure. "I was cleaning your room yesterday, and I found a box in your closet. There were some old letters and a photograph. I didn't mean to pry, but—" I stopped, watching her face carefully.
Her hands stilled, the knitting needles clinking together. For a moment she said nothing, her expression unreadable. Then she set her knitting aside and folded her hands in her lap. "Those are just old things," she said quietly. "Nothing important." I could hear the strain in her voice, the way she avoided my eyes. "They seemed important," I pressed gently. "The letters, they weren't from Dad. Who was the man in the photograph?" A flash of something. Fear, maybe, or anger crossed her face. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It was a long time ago. There's no need to dig up the past." "But Mom, I just want to understand. You've always been so careful about what you share. I feel like there's something you're not telling me." She stood abruptly, her movements sharp. "Some things are better left alone," she said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea what you're asking." I stood too, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away. "Please, Mom, I'm not trying to hurt you. I just want to know the truth." She turned her back to me, her shoulders rigid. "The truth won't change anything. It's over and done with. Let it be." The room felt suddenly colder, the distance between us wider than ever. I wanted to push, to demand answers, but the look on her face stopped me. There was a pain there, a rawness I'd never seen before. I realized that whatever she was hiding, it still had the power to wound her deeply. We stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just let it go, for my sake." I nodded, swallowing my questions, my frustration, my fear. I watched as she gathered her knitting and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. I stood in the empty living room, feeling helpless and alone, the secrets between us thicker than ever. That night, I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind, searching for something I could have said differently, some way to reach her. But the truth was, she wasn't ready to talk. Maybe she never would be. The tension between us lingered, a silent current running beneath every word, every gesture. I tried to act normal, to pretend nothing had changed, but I could feel the distance growing, the questions multiplying. I wondered if I had made a mistake, if I should have left the past alone, but it was too late for that now. The secret was out in the open, even if it remained unspoken. And I knew, deep down, that I couldn't let it go. Not when I was so close to finally understanding the woman who had given up so much for me. In the days that followed our tense conversation, my mother seemed to shrink into herself. She moved through the house with a heaviness I hadn't noticed before, her steps slower, her posture more stooped. The spark that had always animated her, even in her weakest moments, now flickered uncertainly, as if a cold wind had found its way into her heart. She began to forget things, small at first, then more significant. She would leave the kettle boiling until the shrill whistle startled her, or misplace her reading glasses and search the same drawer 3 times. I watched her frustration mount, her hands trembling as she tried to button her blouse or write a grocery list. She snapped at me over little things, then immediately apologized, her voice thin and brittle. I could see the shame in her eyes, the way she looked away when I offered to help. Meals became quieter. She picked at her food, pushing peas around her plate, her appetite fading. Sometimes she would stare at her hands for long minutes, lost in thought, her fork poised in midair. I tried to draw her out with stories from my day, but she only smiled weakly, her mind clearly elsewhere. The television played in the background, but she no longer seemed to follow the plot, her gaze drifting to the window, to the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. At night, I heard her moving restlessly through the house. I would find her in the hallway, her robe pulled tight around her, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. She would claim she couldn't sleep, that she was just getting a glass of water, but I knew better. Sometimes I caught her standing in front of the old mirror in her bedroom, staring at her reflection as if searching for someone she no longer recognized. Other times she would sit at the kitchen table, the tin box open before her, the letters spread out like a deck of cards. She would read them over and over, her lips moving silently, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She grew more withdrawn with each passing day, avoiding phone calls and visitors. When my brother called to check in, she handed the phone to me, shaking her head. "Tell him I'm tired," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stopped answering letters from old friends, letting them pile up unopened on the hall table. The world outside our house seemed to recede, leaving only the two of us and the silence that grew heavier with every secret left unspoken. Her health began to falter in ways I couldn't ignore. She tired easily, her breath short after even the smallest exertion. She developed a persistent cough, and her skin took on a grayish pallor. I urged her to see the doctor, but she resisted, insisting it was nothing, that she just needed rest. I watched her hands shake as she poured her tea, the cup rattling against the saucer. She flinched at sudden noises, her nerves frayed and raw. One afternoon I found her sitting in the garden, her shoulders hunched, her gaze fixed on the wilting roses. She didn't notice me first, and I stood quietly, watching as she reached out to touch a faded bloom, her fingers gentle and trembling. She sighed, a sound so full of sorrow it made my chest ache. I wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but something in her posture held me back, a kind of resignation, as if she had accepted her suffering as her due. The guilt she carried was a living thing, coiling around her spirit, sapping her strength. It showed in the way she avoided my eyes, in the way her laughter had faded to a memory. She seemed to be waiting for something, a reckoning, perhaps, or forgiveness she couldn't ask for. I saw her pain in every gesture, every sigh, every sleepless night. I tried to fill the silence with kindness, bringing her tea, wrapping her in blankets, reading to her from her favorite books. She thanked me, her smile fleeing, but I could see the gratitude was tinged with regret. She would reach for my hand sometimes, holding it tightly, as if afraid I might slip away. In those moments, I felt the depth of her loneliness, the weight of the secret she bore. The house itself seemed to absorb her sorrow, the walls closing in, the air thick with things unsaid. I found myself tiptoeing around her, afraid to say the wrong thing to trigger another wave of guilt or sadness. I longed to break through the barrier between us, to tell her that whatever she had done, it didn't matter, that I loved her still. But the words stuck in my throat, choked by my own fear and uncertainty. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, I watched my mother fade before my eyes, her spirit dimmed by the burden she refused to share. I realized then that guilt, left unspoken, can be as cruel as any illness, eating away at the soul until there is nothing left but regret. And I wondered, with a growing sense of dread, if I would ever learn the truth before it was too late. It happened on a cold, gray morning, the kind that seemed to seep into your bones and settle there. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard a crash from the hallway, a sharp, jarring sound that sent my heart racing. I dropped the mug I was holding and ran, fear tightening in my chest. I found my mother crumpled on the floor, her face pale, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The tin box had spilled open beside her, letters and photographs scattered like fallen leaves. For a moment, she looked so small, so fragile, that I was afraid to touch her. But then she tried to sit up, wincing in pain, and I rushed to her side. "Don't move, Mom. Let me help you." My hands shook as I checked her for injuries, relief flooding through me when I realized nothing was broken. Still, she was trembling, her eyes wide with fear, and something else, shame maybe, or the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. I helped her to the couch, wrapping her in a blanket, my own heart pounding. She clung to my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. For a long time we sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the distant hum of the heater. I wanted to say something comforting, to reassure her, but the words felt hollow. The truth was, I was scared, scared of losing her, scared of what I might learn if she finally let me in. When she had caught her breath, she looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for you to see all this." I squeezed her hand, my own eyes stinging. "Mom, you don't have to be sorry. I just want to help. Please, let me in. Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone anymore." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the letters scattered across the floor. For a moment, I thought she would retreat again, that the wall between us would remain. But then she sighed, a sound so heavy it seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "There are things I've never told you," she said, her voice trembling. "Things I'm not proud of. I thought if I kept them hidden, they couldn't hurt anyone. But I see now that I was wrong." I waited, hardly daring to breathe. She reached for one of the letters, her hands shaking. This was from before you were born, before I met your father." She paused, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "I made mistakes. I hurt people. I hurt myself. And I've been trying to make up for it ever since." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret. I wanted to ask questions, to demand details, but I could see how hard it was for her to speak at all, so I stayed quiet, letting her set the pace. She told me a little, just enough to hint at the pain she'd endured, the choices she'd made out of fear and desperation. She spoke of a love that ended badly, of a decision that haunted her, of a shame that had shaped every day of her life since. Her voice broke as she spoke, and I saw the years of sorrow etched into her face. "I thought if I was a good mother, if I worked hard and did everything right, maybe I could make up for it," she said, her eyes pleading for understanding. "But the past doesn't go away, no matter how much you try to bury it." I reached for her, pulling her into a hug. She clung to me, her body shaking with silent sobs. For the first time, I felt the wall between us begin to crumble,
the secrets that had divided us finally coming to light. When she pulled away, she looked exhausted but lighter somehow, as if sharing even a small part of her burden had eased it. "I can't tell you everything," she said softly. "Not yet, but I want you to know that I love you. That's the one thing I've never been ashamed of." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I love you too, Mom. Whatever happened, it doesn't change that." We sat together for a long time, the letters forgotten on the floor, the past still a shadow between us, but no longer insurmountable. I knew there was more she wasn't ready to share, more pain hidden beneath the surface, but for the first time I felt hope, a fragile, tentative hope that the truth, when it finally came, might set us both free. The days that followed her fall blurred together, each one marked by a deepening sense of urgency. My mother's strength faded quickly, her body growing frailer as if the effort of unburdening her soul had drained what little energy she had left. She spent most of her time in bed now, propped up by pillows, her face turned toward the window, where the late autumn light filtered through the curtains. I stayed close, afraid to leave her side, afraid that if I did, I might miss the moment when she was finally ready to speak. It was on one of those quiet afternoons, the world outside hushed by a gentle rain, that she reached for my hand and squeezed it with surprising strength. Her eyes, once so guarded, were open and searching, as if she was looking for the courage to begin. I sat beside her, my heart pounding, waiting for her to find the words. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," she said, her voice thin but steady, "about the things I never told you. I always thought I was protecting you by keeping them to myself, but I see now that secrets have a way of poisoning everything, even the love between a mother and a child." She paused, her breath catching. I squeezed her hand, encouraging her to go on. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the rain-streaked glass. "Before you were born, I was a different person," she said. "I was young, foolish, and desperate to be loved. I met someone, a man who made me feel special, who promised me the world. I believed him, even when I shouldn't have. I thought he was my future." Her voice trembled, and I could see the pain of memory etched in the lines of her face. "We were together for almost 2 years. I thought we would get married, start a family. But he changed. He became distant, angry. There were arguments, accusations. I tried to fix things, tried to be what he wanted, but it was never enough. One night, after a terrible fight, he left. I never saw him again."
She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks later. I was terrified. My parents were strict, religious. There was no room for mistakes in our family, no forgiveness for girls who strayed. I hid my pregnancy as long as I could, but eventually they found out. The shame was unbearable. My father wouldn't look at me. My mother cried for days. They sent me away to stay with an aunt in another town, told everyone I was visiting for the summer." Her voice faltered, and I felt her hand tighten around mine. "I gave birth to a little girl. She was beautiful, so tiny, so perfect. But my parents had already made arrangements. They said it was for the best, that I was too young, that she deserved a better life. They took her from me before I even had a chance to hold her properly. I never saw her again." The words hung in the air, heavy with grief. I felt my own tears falling, my heart breaking for the young woman my mother had been, for the child she had lost. She looked at me then, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I tried to move on. I met your father, built a new life. I loved him, and I loved you and your brother with all my heart. But there was always a part of me that was missing, a part I could never get back." She reached for the letters on her nightstand, her hands trembling. "These are from her adoptive parents. They sent updates for a few years, photos, little notes about her milestones. I kept every one, even after they stopped writing. I wanted to believe she was happy, that she was loved, but I never stopped wondering, never stopped feeling the shame of what I'd done." Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as tightly as I could, wishing I could take away even a fraction of her pain. "You don't have to be ashamed, Mom," I whispered. "You did what you thought was right. You were just a girl. You didn't deserve to go through that alone." She clung to me, her breath ragged. "I wanted to tell you so many times, but I was afraid you'd think less of me, that you'd see me differently. I tried to be a good mother, to make up for what I'd lost, but the guilt never left me. It colored everything I did." We sat together for a long time, the rain falling softly outside, the room filled with the weight of everything she had finally shared. I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and relief. Sorrow for all she had endured, relief that the truth was finally out in the open. I wanted to ask more, to fill in the gaps, but I could see how exhausted she was, how much it had cost her to say even this much. As the light faded and the shadows lengthened, she squeezed my hand again. "There's more," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Things I still can't say, not yet, maybe not ever, but I need you to know that I love you, that I always have. You and your brother, you were my second chance, my hope." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I love you too, Mom. Nothing you say could ever change that." She smiled then, a small, weary smile, and closed her eyes. I sat beside her, holding her hand, my mind racing with questions, my heart aching with love and regret. I knew there were still secrets she hadn't shared, still shadows in her past that might never come to light. But for the first time, I felt closer to her than I ever had before, bound together by the truth and the promise of forgiveness. And yet, as I watched her drift into a restless sleep, I couldn't help but wonder, what else was she still hiding? What more was left unsaid, locked away in the silent spaces between us? The days grew shorter, the air outside turning crisp and cold, as if the world itself was preparing for an ending. My mother's strength faded with the light, her body growing weaker, her voice softer. She slept more, drifting in and out of dreams, sometimes calling out names I didn't recognize. I stayed by her side, reading to her, holding her hand, waiting for the moments when she would wake and look at me with clear eyes, as if she had something more to say. It was on one of those evenings, the sky outside streaked with the last colors of sunset, that she finally began to speak in earnest. Her breathing was shallow, her skin almost translucent in the fading light. She reached for my hand, her grip surprisingly strong, and fixed me with a gaze that was both pleading and determined. "You need to know more," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't leave this world with you still wondering. You deserve the truth, all of it." I nodded, my heart pounding. I could feel the weight of the moment, the sense that everything in our lives had been leading to this. I squeezed her hand, silently promising that I was ready to hear whatever she needed to say. She took a shaky breath, her eyes drifting to the ceiling, as if searching for the right place to begin. "After they took my baby, I was never the same. I tried to go back to my old life, but nothing fit anymore. My parents acted as if nothing had happened, as if I could just forget. But I couldn't. I carried the shame with me everywhere I went. I felt marked, ruined. I thought I would never be whole again." Her voice broke, and I saw tears glistening in her eyes. "I met your father a year later. He was kind, gentle. He made me laugh again, made me feel like maybe I could have a future. I never told him about the baby. I was afraid he'd see me differently, that he wouldn't want me. I told myself it was better to keep it secret, to start fresh, but the past doesn't let go so easily." She paused, her breath rattling in her chest. I waited, afraid to interrupt, afraid that if I spoke she might lose her courage. "After we married, I tried to be the perfect wife, the perfect mother. When you and your brother were born, I poured everything I had into raising you.
I wanted to protect you from the pain I'd known, to give you the love I'd lost. But the guilt was always there, just beneath the surface. Every time I looked at you, I wondered about the daughter I'd given away. Was she happy? Did she know I loved her? Did she hate me for what I'd done?
She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. I tried to find her, years later. I wrote letters, made phone calls, but the adoption records were sealed. Her new family didn't want contact. I respected their wishes, but it broke my heart all over again. I kept the letters they sent when she was little, the photos, every scrap of her I could hold on to. I watched you and your brother grow, and I loved you with everything I had, but there was always a part of me missing. Her hand tightened around mine, her voice growing more urgent. I know I wasn't always easy to live with. I know I kept things from you, pushed you away when you got too close. I was afraid you'd see the cracks, the places where I was broken. I thought if I could just keep the secret, I could protect you from my shame. But secrets have a way of poisoning everything. They made me hard, made me distant. I'm so sorry for that. I felt tears streaming down my face, my own heart breaking for the young woman she had been, for the mother who had tried so hard to do right by her children, even as she was haunted by the past. I wanted to tell her it was all right, that I understood, but I knew she needed to finish. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Something I've never told anyone. The man in the photograph, the one you found in the box, he wasn't just someone I loved. He was married. I didn't know at first. When I found out, I tried to leave him, but by then I was already pregnant. He begged me to keep quiet, to disappear. He said he'd lose everything if anyone found out. I was so ashamed, so scared. I let my parents handle everything. I let them send me away. I never fought for my baby. I never fought for myself." She covered her face with her hands, her body racked with silent sobs. I moved closer, wrapping my arms around her, holding her as tightly as I could. "You were just a girl, Mom," I whispered. "You did what you thought you had to do. You were alone. You were scared. You don't have to be ashamed anymore." She clung to me, her tears soaking my shirt. "I wanted to tell you so many times. I wanted to be honest, but every time I tried, the words stuck in my throat. I was afraid you'd hate me, that you'd see me as weak, as a failure." I pulled back, looking into her eyes. "I could never hate you. You're the strongest person I know. You survived things I can't even imagine. You gave me and my brother a good life, even when it cost you everything. I love you, Mom. Nothing will ever change that." She smiled then, a small, trembling smile, and I saw a lightness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for loving me, even after everything." We sat together in the fading light, the truth finally out in the open, the secrets that had haunted our family laid bare. I felt a strange sense of peace settle over us, a sense that at last we could begin to heal. But even as I held her, I knew that the scars of the past would never fully disappear. There would always be questions, always be regrets. Yet in that moment, I understood that forgiveness was possible, not just for her, but for myself as well. I could let go of the anger, the confusion, the longing for answers I might never get. I could love her for who she was, not just for the mother she had tried so hard to be. As the darkness gathered outside, my mother drifted into sleep, her breathing slow and even. I sat by her side, holding her hand, feeling the weight of her story settle into my bones. I knew that life would never be the same, that the truth had changed everything, but I also knew that for the first time we were truly together. No more secrets, no more shame, just the quiet, enduring love between a mother and her child. The days after my mother's confession felt unreal, as if I were moving through a world that had shifted on its axis. I found myself replaying her words over and over, trying to fit the pieces of her story into the life I thought I knew. There was shock first, a numb disbelief that the woman who raised me, who had seemed so steady and unyielding, had carried such a heavy secret for so long. I wandered the house in a daze, touching the objects she had cherished, seeing them now as artifacts of a life shaped by loss and regret.
Anger came next, sharp and hot. I was angry at the man who had abandoned her, at my grandparents for their coldness, at the world for being so unforgiving to a frightened young girl. But I was angry at my mother, too, angry that she never trusted me with the truth, that she let her shame build a wall between us. I thought of all the times I'd felt her distance, all the questions she'd brushed aside, and I resented the years we'd lost to silence. But anger couldn't last. It gave way to empathy, to a deep ache for the girl my mother had been and the woman she had become. I saw her sacrifices in a new light, understood the way she had poured herself into our family as both penance and hope. I realized how much she must have suffered, carrying her secret alone, believing she had to atone for a mistake that was never truly hers to bear. I broke for her, for the love she had lost, for the forgiveness she had never given herself. I tried to talk to my brother, to share what I had learned, but the words caught in my throat. When I finally told him, his reaction was a storm of disbelief and confusion. He paced the living room, running his hair through his head, his face pale. "Why didn't she ever say anything?" he demanded. "Why did she let us grow up not knowing?" I had no answers, only the same questions echoing in my own mind. The revelation rippled through our family, testing the bonds we had always taken for granted. My brother grew distant, spending long hours away from the house, returning late and silent. I caught him once in the hallway, staring at the old family photos, his expression troubled. "Do you think she ever loved us the same?" he asked quietly. I wanted to reassure him, to tell him that her love for us was real, but I understood his doubt. The truth had unsettled everything, made us question the foundation of our lives.
Other relatives reacted with a mix of shock and awkward sympathy. An aunt called, her voice trembling, to say she wished she had known, that she would have helped if she could. A cousin sent a letter, full of platitudes about forgiveness and family, but I could sense the discomfort beneath her words. The story spread quietly, a ripple of gossip and concern, and I felt exposed, as if my mother's shame had become my own. Through it all, I tried to care for my mother, to show her that I still loved her, that nothing had changed between us. But there were moments when I pulled away, unable to bridge the gap between the woman I thought I knew and the one she had revealed. I saw the pain in her eyes, the way she watched me with hope and fear, and I hated myself for my hesitation. I wanted to be strong for her, to offer the forgiveness she so desperately needed, but I was still finding my own way through the wreckage of her confession. Grief settled over the house like a heavy blanket. I grieved for the mother I had lost, for the innocence that would never return, for the years spent in ignorance and silence. I grieved for the sister I had never known, for the family we might have been. But beneath the grief, there was a slow, tentative healing, a sense that even in the aftermath of so much pain, we might find a way forward. In the quiet moments, I sat by my mother's side, holding her hand, letting her know I was still there. I listened when she wanted to talk, and I sat in silence when she could not. I tried to forgive her, and in doing so, I began to forgive myself for all the things I could not change. The aftershocks of her revelation would linger, reshaping our family in ways I could not yet imagine. But I knew as I watched her drift in and out of sleep that we were learning to live with the truth, one day, one breath, one fragile act of love at a time. In the wake of my mother's confession, I found myself hungry for answers, desperate to fill in the gaps she had left behind. The story she'd shared was raw and powerful, but it was also incomplete, a patchwork of pain and memory with edges that didn't quite meet. I needed to know more, not just for myself, but for her. I wanted to understand the world she had lived in, the choices she had made, and the forces that had shaped her shame. I started with the letters she had kept, reading them again and again, searching for clues. The handwriting of her daughter's adoptive parents was careful and kind, their words full of gratitude and hope. They wrote about milestones, first steps, first words, birthdays celebrated with laughter and cake. There were photographs, too, a little girl with my mother's eyes, growing older with each snapshot, her smile bright and unburdened. I studied those images, wondering what she knew of her origins, if she ever sensed the longing that had traveled with each letter. I reached out to my mother's sister, my aunt, who lived in another state. We hadn't spoken in years, but when I called, she seemed to know why I was reaching out. Her voice was gentle, tinged with regret. "Your mother was so young," she said. "Our parents were strict, and the times were different. There was no room for mistakes, no forgiveness for girls who broke the rules. She was sent away, and we were told not to ask questions. I wish I had done more. I wish I had been braver." Her words filled in some of the blanks, painting a picture of a family bound by pride and fear, a world where shame was a weapon and secrets were armor. I realized how alone my mother must have felt, how impossible it would have been to fight for herself or her child. The anger I had felt toward her began to soften, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. I searched through old family documents, piecing together timelines and names. I found my mother's high school yearbook, her face bright and hopeful among the black and white portraits. There were notes in the margins, messages from friends who had faded from her life. I wondered which of them had known her secret, which had turned away when the truth came out. I found a faded envelope addressed to my grandparents, the postmark from the town where my mother had given birth. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal notice from the adoption agency. The language was cold, impersonal, a transaction, not a tragedy. I spoke with my brother again, sharing what I had learned. He listened quietly, his anger spent, his eyes sad. "She did the best she could," he said at last. "We all did." We sat together in silence, the weight of our family's history settling between us. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a sense that we were not alone in our confusion and grief. I even tried to find out more about my lost sister, searching online for any trace of her. I found nothing concrete, just the knowledge that she was out there somewhere, living a life shaped by choices none of us could undo. I hoped she was happy, that she had found the love and security my mother had wanted for her. Through it all, I came to understand that my mother's shame was not just her own. It was the product of a time and a culture that punished women for their mistakes, that demanded silence and sacrifice. She had carried that burden for decades, believing it was hers alone to bear. But as I pieced together her story, I saw the truth. She was braver than she knew, loving us fiercely even as she mourned what she had lost. In seeking understanding, I found forgiveness, not just for my mother, but for myself, for my family, for all the ways we had failed each other. I realized that the past could not be changed, but it could be faced, and in facing it, we could begin to heal. The days grew quieter as my mother's strength faded, the house settling into a hush that felt both peaceful and heavy. I spent as much time as I could by her side, reading to her, holding her hand, and simply sitting in silence. The air between us was different now, softer, gentler, as if the truth had finally cleared away the last of the old shadows. I could see the relief in her eyes, the way her shoulders seemed lighter, her breath a little easier. She no longer flinched from my touch or avoided my gaze. Instead, she welcomed me with a tired but genuine smile, as if she was finally allowing herself to be loved, flaws and all. One afternoon, as the winter sun slanted through the window, she reached for my hand and squeezed it. Her skin was cool and papery, her grip weak but determined. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, "for everything I kept from you, for all the ways I let my shame come between us." I shook my head,
tears stinging my eyes. "You don't have to be sorry, Mom. I understand now. I wish you hadn't had to carry it alone, but I'm glad you told me. I'm glad I know who you really are." She looked at me, her eyes shining with gratitude and something like wonder. "I was so afraid you'd hate me, that you'd see me as weak or selfish or less of a mother." I leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You were never less. You were more. You did the best you could, and you gave me everything you had. I forgive you, Mom. I love you."
A single tear slipped down her cheek, and she smiled, a real, unguarded smile that made her look young again, if only for a moment. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what that means to me." We sat together in the fading light, the silence between us finally comfortable. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a release of the anger and confusion I'd carried for so long. I realized that forgiveness wasn't just for her, it was for me too. Letting go of the resentment, the questions, the longing for a different past, I found space for compassion and understanding. I saw my mother not just as the woman who raised me, but as a person who had suffered, loved, and tried her best in a world that hadn't always been kind. In her final days, my mother seemed to find a quiet acceptance. She spoke less of the past and more of the present, of the things she loved, the memories she cherished, the hopes she still held for me and my brother. She asked me to promise that I would look after him, that I would keep our family together even when she was gone. I promised, my voice thick with emotion, and she squeezed my hand in silent thanks. The night she passed, I was there, holding her hand, whispering words of love and comfort. Her breathing slowed, her grip loosened, and then she was gone, peaceful at last, her face free of pain and fear. I sat with her for a long time, letting the tears come, feeling the weight of both loss and gratitude. I knew I would miss her every day, but I also knew that we had found our way back to each other in the end. In the days that followed, I moved through the motions of grief, making arrangements, calling relatives, sorting through her things. But beneath the sorrow, there was a sense of closure, a knowledge that nothing had been left unsaid. I had forgiven her, and in doing so, I had freed us both from the chains of the past. Yet as I stood in the quiet house, surrounded by memories and the echoes of her voice, I couldn't help but wonder, what would life look like after this? How would I carry her story forward, honor her memory, and build a future shaped by truth and forgiveness? The answers were unclear, but for the first time, I felt ready to face them, one day at a time, with an open heart and the hope that healing, like love, could grow in even the most unexpected places. In the weeks after my mother's passing, the world felt both emptier and strangely new. The house was quieter, the routines that had once defined my days now hollowed out by her absence. Yet as I moved through the rooms she had filled with her presence, I found myself seeing everything differently. The truth she had finally shared with me had changed the way I looked at her, at myself, and at the family we had built together. I realized as I sorted through her belongings that every object told a story. Some I knew, and some I would never fully understand. The old tin box, the faded letters, the photographs of a lost sister, these were no longer just relics of a hidden past, but pieces of a larger tapestry. My mother's life was not defined by her shame, but by her resilience, her capacity for love, and her willingness to keep going even when the world seemed determined to break her. I thought often about the lessons I had learned in those final weeks. I learned that secrets, no matter how well-intentioned, can build walls between people who love each other. I learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a process, a choice made again and again to let go of anger and make room for understanding. Most of all, I learned that the truth,
even when it hurts, is always better than silence.
My relationship with my brother changed too. We talked more openly than we ever had before, sharing memories, regrets, and hopes for the future. The revelation of our mother's past had shaken us, but it had also brought us closer, reminding us that family is not just about blood, but about the willingness to show up for each other, to listen, and to forgive. We made a promise to keep her memory alive, not as a figure shrouded in mystery, but as a woman who had loved fiercely and tried her best. I reached out to my aunt again, and together we pieced together more of my mother's story. We laughed and cried over old photographs, filling in the blanks with stories that had been left untold for too long. I even wrote a letter to the address I found in the adoption papers, not knowing if it would ever reach my lost sister, but hoping that somehow the truth would find its way to her too. As the seasons changed and the first hints of spring appeared in the garden, I felt a quiet hope growing inside me. My mother's story was not just one of loss and regret, but of survival and transformation. She had given me the gift of truth, and with it, the freedom to move forward without the weight of secrets. I knew there would still be hard days, moments when grief would catch me off guard, but I also knew that I was not alone. I carried her love with me, woven into the fabric of my life. A new beginning is never easy. It means letting go of what was, accepting what is, and daring to imagine what could be. I didn't have all the answers, but I had learned to trust in the power of honesty, forgiveness, and love. I stepped into the future with open eyes and an open heart, ready to build a life that honored my mother's memory, not by hiding from the past, but by embracing it and letting it shape me into someone stronger, kinder, and more whole. As I look back on everything my mother shared and all that I've discovered, I realize that every family has its secrets, some buried deep, others just waiting for the right moment to come to light. The truth changed me, but it also set me free, reminding me that love and forgiveness can heal even the oldest wounds. I carry her story with me now, not as a burden, but as a testament to the strength it takes to face the past and choose a new beginning. But if you think this was the only secret in our family, you're wrong. There are still unanswered questions, old letters tucked away in drawers, and stories whispered behind closed doors. Some truths are waiting for their own moment to be revealed, and when they are, I'll be here to share them with you, because every family has a story, and ours is far from over.